A mother, German shepherd, stood trembling in the snow, her body wrapped around two tiny puppies barely breathing. Their fur was frozen stiff, their cries fading into the wind. No one was supposed to stop on that road, but fate had other plans. A Navy SEAL, driving through the storm with nothing left to live for, saw them through the blur of falling snow. 3 lives hanging by a thread. When he opened his truck door and reached out his hand, something in both of them changed forever. What happened next will make you believe that even the coldest hearts can thaw when love finds its way. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below. The late winter air over Silver Creek carried a silence that could drown a man. The snow had been falling for hours, layering the mountain road in thick white that blurred the line between heaven and earth. A thin, blue twilight settled across the Colorado pines, their branches bending low under the storm's weight. Somewhere between the wind and the whisper of snowflakes on the windshield, Ethan Cole wondered, not for the first time, if the world had forgotten him. He had been driving for miles with no destination, his pickup's tires biting through slush, the heater humming faintly. Ethan, 38, tall, broad-shouldered, with the posture of a man trained never to collapse, looked like someone carved from old stone in hard winters. His face, weathered and sharp, bore a short, trimmed beard the color of ash and sand. The faint streaks of gray in his dark hair made him seem older than his years, though his eyes were still the clear steel blue of a man who once believed in purpose. Once, he had been a Navy SEAL, the kind of soldier others followed without question. Now, he was just a name in a small-town mechanic's ledger, a man who lived alone in a cabin at the edge of Silver Creek, haunted by a love and a war he could not leave behind. The storm pressed harder. Snow wrapped the trees and power lines into pale ghosts. Ethan's wipers struggled, and the world outside became a tunnel of white. He slowed as he approached a curve he knew well, a place where the guardrail bent outward, where years ago a truck had gone off the road. He had seen the cross nailed there once, white against the pines. He didn't know whose it was, but he always slowed when passing it, as if grief had become a landmark, and then he saw it, something dark against the snow. At first, it looked like a fallen branch, but the shape moved, shivering, low and small. Ethan hit the brakes. His truck slid, fishtailed, stopped with a soft crunch of tires in the powder. The wind howled through the mountain pass as he squinted through the window. There, barely visible under a drift, was a large German shepherd, her fur matted with ice. She was curled protectively around 2 tiny puppies, their bodies pressed into her chest for warmth that no longer came. Ethan's chest tightened. He opened the door, and the cold slapped him full in the face. Snowflakes clung to his beard as he stepped out, boots sinking deep. The air smelled of pine and frozen earth. He crouched slowly, lowering himself to their level, his breath visible in shaky clouds. "Hey there," he said softly, his voice low and rough, the kind of voice that had once given orders through radio static and sandstorms. "Easy, girl." The mother dog lifted her head. Her eyes, amber, wild, and frightened, locked on his. She didn't growl. She didn't move. Only her gaze spoke. A question, a plea. Her fur was black and tan, thick but soaked, clumped with frost. One ear drooped slightly, maybe from an old injury. Beneath her, the 2 puppies barely stirred, tiny replicas of her, their paws trembling. breath faint. Ethan knelt closer, extending his hand through the wind. The snow bit into his skin, reddening his knuckles. He could feel the tremor in his fingers, not from the cold, but from the memory that slammed into him like a wave. It had been 2 winters ago. Another storm, another road. His wife, Anna, sitting beside him, singing softly to the radio before the tires hit black ice. He still remembered the scream of twisting metal, the sickening silence that followed, the blood on his gloves. He had pulled her from the wreckage, carried her through the snow until his legs gave out. She had looked up at him then, her lips blue, and whispered, "It's not your fault." But he had never believed her. Since that day, Ethan had carried the guilt like a second heartbeat, steady, unrelenting. Now, looking into the dog's eyes, he saw the same desperation, the same fight against an ending that felt inevitable. He swallowed hard, the ache in his throat thick. "You're not dying out here," he murmured. "Not tonight." Behind him, the wind screamed across the ridge. He could hear the faint jingle of his truck keys swinging from the ignition. The warmth from the cab called to him, but he didn't move. Slowly, he unzipped his jacket, removed his scarf, and held it out. The dog's ears twitched. One of the pups gave a weak, pitiful sound, a breath that could have been a cry. Ethan moved closer, inch by inch, his knees sinking into the snow. "It's okay." His voice softened, almost a whisper now. He had spoken those same words years ago to a dying soldier in Afghanistan, a young man, barely 20, shot through the lung. The boy had gripped Ethan's hand and smiled through the blood, believing the lie because Ethan had made it sound like hope. Now, he didn't know if he was lying again. The mother dog blinked, then lowered her head slightly, as if surrendering to something larger than fear. Ethan took another step. His hand trembled as he reached out, palm open, fingers stiff. His breath caught when she didn't pull away. Instead, her nose touched his fingertips, cold and damp. Her eyes held his for one long second, and in that fragile silence, something in him cracked open. He could feel the sting in his eyes before he realized he was crying. "You're safe now," he whispered. The words escaped like a confession. The snow thickened, falling in slow, heavy flakes. Ethan carefully lifted one of the puppies, wrapping it in the inner fold of his jacket. It was lighter than he expected, bones and trembling warmth. The mother watched, tense but still. When he reached for the second pup, she shifted, letting him. The movement cost her strength. He saw her body sag. He looked at her. "Come on, girl, let's get you out of this." He stood, turning toward the truck, the wind cutting at his face. He opened the back door, placed the puppies gently on the seat, then turned back for the mother. She hadn't followed. Instead, she stared at him from the snow, her breath shallow, steam curling from her nose. She didn't trust him fully yet. And maybe, he thought, neither did he trust himself. He crouched again, extended his hand once more through the swirl of snow. For a heartbeat, nothing moved. Then slowly, painfully, she rose, one paw sinking deep, then another, limping forward through the cold. Ethan stayed still, his hand steady in the freezing air. Behind him, in a house tucked further down the road, Helen Carter stood by her kitchen window. The widow's hair was white as frost, her frame slight but steady. She wore a faded green cardigan and house slippers, the kind old people never throw away. She noticed the truck lights parked too long near the curve and frowned. The storm was getting worse. Her heart, weary but still tender, stirred with unease. She reached for a candle on the table, lit it, and whispered a prayer. Let whoever's out there find their way home. Back on the roadside, Ethan's hand hovered in the cold. The German Shepherd took another step forward, her paw prints filling slowly with snow. The wind howled around them, wrapping man and animal in the same fragile world of white. He could feel her warmth now, faint but real. It's okay, he whispered again, his voice barely audible under the storm. You're safe now. And as the mother dog pressed her nose against his palm, leaning into that trembling human hand, Ethan realized this was the first time since Anna's death that he had reached out, not to hold on, but to save. The snow kept falling, covering the tracks behind them. In that small circle of storm and breath and trembling trust, two broken souls found the courage to move toward warmth again. The snowstorm had thinned by the time Ethan Cole reached his cabin at the edge of Silver Creek. The headlights of his truck cut a narrow tunnel through the fading white. The world outside, now quiet and heavy, like breath held too long. His cabin, built of dark pine and stone, stood half buried in snowdrifts, smoke still rising weakly from the chimney where the fire he'd left smoldering earlier had nearly died. He parked the truck close to the porch, stepped out, and the cold bit his skin, sharp as needles. Inside the cab, the two puppies huddled in a nest of wool blankets, faint tremors rippling through their tiny frames. Their mother, Mara, lay still on the seat beside them, her fur crusted with ice, eyes half open, but alert. She had not fought him when he lifted her into the truck earlier, though her gaze had stayed wary, as if she was willing to trust only until her strength returned. Ethan opened the door and spoke softly. We're home. Let's get you warm. He carried Mara first, cradling her weight against his chest. She was lighter than she looked, her ribs pressing against his arm, her breath shallow but steady. He could feel the steady rhythm of her heart against him, a fragile percussion that kept time with his own. Inside, the cabin smelled of pine wood, coffee, and the faint trace of engine oil. The single room space was simple but solid. A brick hearth on one wall, a small table near the window, two framed photos that had gathered dust, one of him in uniform, another of a woman smiling against a field of wheat. Anna. He paused, just a heartbeat, before turning toward the fire. He laid Mara near the hearth on an old wool rug, then rushed back to the truck for the puppies, Scout and Ember. He didn't know their names yet, but the thought formed anyway, were so small they could fit into his hands. He wrapped them in a spare flannel shirt and placed them against their mother's belly. Mara stirred weakly, nosing each pup, checking, counting. Ethan added logs to the fire, the dry wood catching with a sigh of sparks. The orange glow spread across the room, dancing over the rough wood walls, across his tired face, and onto the 3 lives he'd pulled from the snow. Hours passed in silence, except for the crackling fire and the rhythmic sound of breathing. Small, uneven, but alive. Ethan sat on the floor, leaning against the wall, watching them. His own hands, scarred and calloused from years of war, looked foreign beside such fragile creatures. He remembered a night in Kandahar, years ago, when he and his team had found a wounded street dog near a collapsed building. They'd fed it scraps from their rations, watched it limp away into the desert. Funny, his teammate had said then, how we always save everything except ourselves. Ethan hadn't understood the truth of that until now. By dawn, the worst of the storm had passed. The sky outside the small window glowed a soft gray, snow still whispering against the glass. Mara had begun to regain strength. She lifted her head when Ethan knelt beside her, her eyes softer than before. Her fur, now dry, shimmered under the firelight, thick, black and tan with streaks of silver down her muzzle. She looked older up close, maybe 6 or 7 years, a veteran in her own right. He reached out slowly, and she allowed his touch on her head. "Mara," he said quietly, testing the word. "You look like a Mara." The name felt right. Strong, loyal, wounded, but proud. The smaller puppy, the one with the lighter paws, sneezed suddenly and stirred. "Scout," Ethan murmured, smiling faintly. The other one, darker, stubbornly clung to his mother's side, pushing his tiny nose against her fur. "And you," he said, "you're Ember." He sat back, the names anchoring him in a strange peace. For the first time in years, there was warmth in the cabin that wasn't just from the fire. A knock came at the door, a soft, hesitant sound. Ethan tensed, instinct flaring before memory caught up. He opened it to find Helen Carter standing there, her figure small and wrapped in a thick wool coat the color of faded plum. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold, wisps of silver hair escaping the scarf tied beneath her chin. Helen had lived down the road for as long as Ethan could remember. Widowed, polite, always waving from her porch, but never pressing for conversation. "Morning, Mr. Cole," she said, her voice gentle but firm. She held a basket in her hands, steam rising from it. "I saw your truck last night. You were out in that storm. I figured you'd need something warm." Ethan stepped aside, uncertain. "Thank you. I didn't mean to worry anyone." Helen stepped in, her boots squeaking faintly on the wooden floor. Her eyes widened as she saw the dogs near the fire. "Oh, my Lord," she whispered. "You found them?" "By the highway," Ethan said. "They wouldn't have lasted another hour." Helen crouched down beside Mara, her knees cracking slightly with the movement. "You poor thing," she murmured. Her hands were wrinkled, delicate, the veins blue beneath the skin, but steady as she stroked the dog's head. "She reminds me of Max, my son's dog. Big German Shepherd, too. Stayed by his side until..." Her voice faltered, but she smiled through it. Always loyal, always putting others first. Ethan studied her quietly. He knew her son's name from the small memorial plaque near the town square. Daniel Carter, U.S. Marine Corps, 2008. He remembered seeing Helen there once, laying flowers, her face calm in a way that only comes after years of learning how to live with pain. "You were a SEAL, weren't you?" she asked softly, not looking at him. He hesitated, then nodded. "Was. A long time ago." Helen's eyes met his. "You don't stop being one. You just fight different battles after." She stood, brushing her coat. "I brought ginger tea and some antibiotics for the dogs. It's the least I can do." "Thank you," Ethan said again. The words felt inadequate. She smiled faintly. "You look like you haven't slept in weeks. Keep yourself warm too, Mr. Cole. No good saving lives if you forget your own." After she left, Ethan stood by the door for a long moment, watching her small figure disappear into the snow. The candlelight from her kitchen window flickered faintly through the trees, a tiny flame in the distance, steady against the gray. He turned back to the fire. Mara lifted her head, ears twitching. The two puppies stirred, their soft bodies pressing against each other. Ethan sat beside them, the warmth from the hearth wrapping around him like a blanket he hadn't realized he missed. Outside, the snow began to ease, melting into faint drips from the roof. Inside, The rhythm of small breaths filled the silence. He watched Mara watching him, both of them uncertain what came next. But for now, there was peace, a fragile, fleeting peace, born of firelight and footsteps and second chances. By late afternoon, the mountains of Silver Creek had vanished behind a curtain of white. The new storm had come faster than the forecast promised, rolling down from the northern peaks like an army advancing under cover of snow. The air was sharp, the kind that burned in the lungs, and the pines groaned as the wind howled through them. Ethan Cole stood on his cabin porch, watching the light fade, the horizon dissolving into the storm. Inside, the fire crackled weakly, and Mara's breathing had grown shallow. He'd noticed her decline that morning, her steps slower, her appetite gone, eyes dull. At first, he thought it was exhaustion from the cold, but when he saw the tremor in her flank and the thickening breath, he knew it was fever. Now, as the wind screamed across the valley, he crouched beside her. Her fur, once glossy under the firelight, had lost its sheen. The two puppies whimpered softly, nudging her for warmth. He pressed his palm against her side. She was hot to the touch. "Hang in there, girl," he murmured. "You've made it this far." He moved to the corner of the cabin, where an old toolbox served as storage for more than nails and wire. He kept a small emergency kit there, a few bandages, some pain relievers, iodine, but nothing that would help a dog fighting an infection. The power flickered once, twice, and then died with a heavy click. The lights dimmed, leaving the room bathed in orange from the fireplace. The silence that followed was unnerving, a world stripped of electricity and sound except for the wind and Mara's labored breathing. Ethan looked toward the window. Snow had already buried the steps of his porch. If the temperature dropped further, they wouldn't survive the night without help. He pulled on his parka and gloves, his breath visible in the freezing air. He looked at Mara again, her head resting between her paws. "I'll be right back," he said. "Don't give up on me now." The distance to Helen Carter's house wasn't far, less than a mile down the road, but in a storm like this, it felt endless. The snow reached his knees, and each gust drove needles of ice into his face. He pushed forward, his flashlight cutting a narrow path through the darkness. He had walked through sandstorms in Afghanistan that lasted for days, but this was different. There were no orders, no team, no mission objective, just a single promise he'd made to a creature that couldn't even speak. By the time he reached Helen's porch, his beard was crusted with frost. He knocked hard. The door opened after a moment, and warm light spilled out, golden and soft. Helen stood there wrapped in a heavy knit shawl, her silver hair pulled back into a loose bun. Her face was pale but calm, lined with the kind of wrinkles that came from years of kindness rather than bitterness. "Ethan," she said, startled. "What on earth?" "She's sick," he interrupted, shivering. "Mara, I think it's an infection. The power's out at my place. I need antibiotics. Anything you've got for dogs. And maybe your generator." Helen's expression softened immediately. "Come in before you freeze solid." Her home smelled faintly of rosemary and old wood polish. Family photographs lined the mantel. Smiling faces in military uniforms. A younger Helen standing beside a broad-shouldered man with laughing eyes. Ethan's gaze lingered on a single frame. A soldier in desert camo, early 20s, arm slung around a German shepherd. The caption beneath read, "Daniel Carter, U.S. Marines, 2008. Helen followed his eyes and spoke quietly. That's my boy. He served in Basra. He was leading his unit across a riverbed when they came under fire. He pulled 2 men out before..." She stopped herself, then exhaled. "The dog survived. They sent him back to me afterward. Max. He lived for 4 more years. Slept beside my bed every night until the end." Ethan nodded, throat tight. He must have been loyal. She smiled sadly. Too loyal. Sometimes they love us past the point of reason. She moved to a cabinet and rummaged through bottles. "Here," she said, handing him a small container. "These are antibiotics for infections. You'll have to crush them, mix with water. And take this," she added, lifting a portable heater. "It's battery-powered. Won't last forever, but it'll help." Ethan hesitated. "I can't take your last one." Helen's eyes softened. "You can, and you will. I've lived through worse winters than this. Besides, you're not the only one who needs saving tonight." She handed him a thermos of tea. "For you, not for her." He accepted it with a nod. "Thank you." The storm outside had intensified by the time they stepped back onto the porch. Helen looked at the white chaos and frowned. "You'll never make it back alone," she said. "Wait 1 minute." She disappeared inside and returned with a thick wool coat, a scarf, and a flashlight strapped to her wrist. "You're not going out there without another pair of hands. You don't have to." "I know I don't," she interrupted, "but some things you just do anyway." Together, they trudged through the snow, leaning against the wind. The road had vanished entirely, replaced by a white wasteland. Ethan guided her by memory, his gloved hand gripping her elbow when she stumbled. She was surprisingly resilient for her age. Short, sturdy, with a determination that reminded him of the medics he'd served with. By the time the cabin came into view, both were shaking from cold. Inside, the air was thin and heavy. Mara lay motionless near the fire, her body trembling. The puppies whimpered beside her. Helen set the heater on the floor and crouched without hesitation. "She's burning up," she murmured. "We need to cool her down gradually. Bring me some water." Ethan filled a bowl from the snow he'd gathered in a pot earlier. They crushed the tablets and mixed them carefully. Helen's hands were steady, her movements precise. "You'd make a fine field medic," Ethan said quietly. She smiled faintly. "I learned from someone who was." They worked through the night. Ethan fed the fire until his arms ached from splitting wood. Helen stayed beside Mara, whispering to her softly as though she could understand. At one point, Ethan caught her murmuring a prayer. The wind outside screamed, the shutters rattled, but inside there was a stillness born of shared purpose. Sometime past midnight, the puppies stopped crying and fell asleep. Mara's breathing evened out, the violent tremors subsiding. Helen leaned back, exhaustion painting her face. Ethan handed her a blanket. She took it, then looked at him. "You know," she said softly, "Daniel wasn't trying to be a hero that day. He told me once he didn't believe in medals. He just believed some people are born to protect others, no matter the cost." Ethan stared into the fire. "Maybe he was right." Helen nodded. "You, that dog, my boy. You all share the same stubborn heart." Outside, the first light of dawn crept through the snow clouds. Mara stirred, lifting her head for the first time in hours. Her amber eyes found Ethan's, and she exhaled a slow, steady breath. Relief flooded him, quiet but immense. Helen reached over and touched his shoulder. "You didn't just save her," she said softly. "You saved yourself." Ethan didn't answer. He simply looked at the dog, the firelight dancing across her fur, and realized the battle he'd been fighting all these years had never been in the deserts overseas. It had been here, in the silence of his own heart, waiting for something worth saving again. The storm had passed, leaving Silver Creek wrapped in a world of white silence. The snow glistened under the pale sunlight, smooth and untouched except for a few paw prints that led from the porch of Ethan's cabin to the trees beyond. The air was crisp and clean, the kind that carried both stillness and renewal. Inside, warmth pulsed from the hearth, and for the first time in months the cabin smelled not of smoke or loneliness, but of life. Wet fur, pine wood, and something quietly human. Mara lay near the fire, her breathing strong again, her fur once more thick and shining. She had regained her strength quickly after the fever, though a small scar still marked her shoulder, where Helen's careful treatment had helped the infection drain. Her eyes followed the movement of her two puppies, Scout and Ember, who were now sturdy enough to run clumsily across the wooden floor. They wrestled with each other, paws thumping, tails wagging wildly. Scout, the lighter of the two with sand-colored paws, was bold and curious. He barked at his own reflection in the iron kettle, tail beating like a drum. Ember, smaller and darker, preferred to stay close to his mother, but occasionally darted forward to tug at his brother's ear. Their antics filled the room with small, chaotic bursts of joy that chased away the ghosts that had long haunted Ethan's walls. Ethan sat at the workbench by the window, fixing a broken latch. His hair, now longer and untrimmed, curled slightly at the nape of his neck. The sunlight caught the silver streaks among the brown, making him look older, but calmer, as if the weight on his shoulders had begun to shift. He glanced over at the dogs, a faint smile tugging at his lips. The sound of their paws was rhythmic, like the echo of a heartbeat he'd forgotten he had. "You two are trouble," he muttered. Scout barked in reply, as if to agree. Helen Carter had started visiting more often after that night of the storm. Sometimes she brought soup. Sometimes just company. She arrived that morning with her usual soft knock, wrapped in her heavy plum-colored coat, her scarf tucked neatly under her chin. Her cheeks glowed pink from the cold. "I come bearing gifts," she announced, holding up a basket. "And before you argue, I don't take orders from retired soldiers." Ethan chuckled. A low sound, rough from disuse. "You sure you want to keep trudging through the snow for a man who lives with 3 freeloaders?" Helen's eyes twinkled. "Those freeloaders saved you, if I recall correctly. And besides, I needed to see them." She leaned down as Scout ran to greet her, his tail sweeping the floor like a feather duster. "Well, look at you," she said, scratching his ears. "You've gotten big enough to cause trouble." Ember hung back shyly, watching with cautious eyes. Helen extended her hand. "Come here, little one." Slowly, the puppy approached, pressing his nose against her palm. While Helen set down her basket, Ethan noticed her limp slightly, something he hadn't before. "You all right?" he asked. "Oh, just an old injury," she said, waving it off. "Fell off a ladder 2 winters ago, fixing a gutter. Daniel would have scolded me for it if he were still around." Her tone softened when she said her son's name, but it wasn't sorrowful anymore. More like remembering something she could finally hold without breaking. She moved around the cabin with the ease of someone who belonged there. "Your roof's still dripping near the kitchen," she observed. "You'll need to patch it before the next melt." "I've been meaning to," Ethan replied. "Meaning to doesn't count. I'll help." True to her word, She climbed onto a small stool with a hammer while Ethan steadied her. Together, they replaced 2 warped planks and sealed the seam with tar. The work was quiet, but there was a comfort in that silence, a wordless rhythm of cooperation, like 2 musicians keeping the same time. When they finished, Ethan brewed coffee on the stove, and Helen sat by the fire while Mara rested her head on her lap. "You know," Helen said, "Daniel once brought home a stray when he was 12, a scruffy little thing with one ear bent. I told him no, that we couldn't keep it, but he said, 'Mom, some things you can't turn away from, no matter how small.'" She smiled wistfully. He was right. Ethan stared into his cup, the rising steam fogging his vision. I used to think saving people was about missions, plans, objectives, but it's really just showing up when no one else will. Helen looked at him closely, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "You're not just showing up anymore, Ethan. You're living again." He didn't answer, but the faint smile returned. Outside, the wind had quieted. Through the window, he could see the snow melting from the trees, dripping like silver threads. The world was thawing, slowly, stubbornly, beautifully. Later that afternoon, as Helen prepared to leave, Ethan offered to walk her halfway down the road. She refused gently. "You've got your hands full here," she said, nodding toward the dogs. "And besides, I like the quiet of walking home. Reminds me I'm still strong enough to do it." He helped her into her coat anyway, his hand brushing the sleeve. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" "For not letting me stay a ghost." Helen smiled, her eyes bright with something that was half joy, half ache. "We all need a reason to keep the fire burning. You found yours." When she was gone, Ethan returned to the hearth. The puppies were tangled together in sleep, their bellies rising and falling. Mara watched him, her tail thumping once against the rug. Ethan sat on the floor beside them, leaning back against the couch. The sun dipped low, sending long bars of gold across the cabin. The harmonica sat on the mantel where it had been untouched for years. It had belonged to Anna, his wife, whose laughter still lived somewhere in the walls of this house. He hesitated, then reached for it. The first note was shaky, uncertain, but as he played, the sound steadied, soft, soulful, almost human. Scout lifted his head curiously. Ember yawned and curled tighter against Mara. The melody was simple, one Anna used to hum while washing dishes. Home, home again. By the second verse, something strange happened. Ethan laughed. It wasn't loud or forced. It simply escaped, raw and honest, like air finally finding its way back into his lungs. The sound startled even him. Outside, the sky blushed orange as the sun slipped behind the pines. Through the window, Helen paused on her walk home. She turned at the sound of the harmonica faintly carried through the wind. Inside the cabin, she could see through the glass. Ethan sitting cross-legged, the dogs curled around him, firelight glowing against his face. For the first time since Daniel's death, Helen felt tears, not of grief, but peace. She whispered to herself, "He's finally home." And in that quiet mountain valley, laughter, small, human, and whole, found its way back to both of them. The first sign of trouble came on a quiet morning that smelled of melting snow and coffee. The air outside the cabin had softened. Spring was coming to Silver Creek. Patches of grass peeked through the white crust, and the stream behind Ethan's land had begun to sing again beneath its thin skin of ice. Inside, the warmth of the fire mixed with the sound of Scout and Ember wrestling near the door, their paws clicking against the wooden floor. Mara watched from her favorite spot beside the hearth, head tilted, amber eyes bright with contentment. It had been weeks since the storm, and life had found its rhythm, simple, wordless, and whole. Ethan sat by the window, oiling the worn harmonica in his hands. His beard had grown in, salt and pepper now, softening the sharpness of his jaw. He looked older than his 38 years, but steadier, his movements patient, deliberate. He had learned to measure peace the way soldiers learn to measure distance, by how long it lasts before something breaks it. The break came in the form of a knock. 3 firm raps on the wooden door, too sharp to belong to Helen. Mara's ears shot up. Scout and Ember froze mid-play, tails rigid. Ethan frowned, stood, and opened the door. A man in uniform stood on the porch, his presence cutting through the calm like a blade through frost. He was in his early 40s, tall, built solid from years outdoors. His uniform bore the dark green insignia of the Montana Department of Wildlife. The name patch read Daniels. His face was square and weather-beaten, skin browned by the sun, short sandy hair dusted with snow. His expression, though polite, carried the weight of official purpose. "Morning," Daniels said, removing his gloves. "You Ethan Cole?" Ethan nodded slowly. "That's me." "Officer Daniels, State Wildlife Service." He handed over a badge, metal glinting faintly. "We've received a report. Someone out here's been harboring wild animals, specifically a large canine species matching a German Shepherd or wolf hybrid. Sound familiar?" Ethan's stomach tightened. He stepped slightly aside so Daniels could see the fire-lit cabin. "You're looking at them," he said quietly. "They're German Shepherds, domestic. The mother was abandoned, not wild. I found them during the blizzard." Daniels's eyes scanned the room, sharp and trained. He studied Mara, then the 2 pups, his gaze narrowing. "Abandoned, huh? You got paperwork, veterinary records, ownership tags?" Ethan shook his head. "They were dying in the snow. There wasn't exactly time for paperwork." The officer sighed, pulling a small notebook from his chest pocket. "Look, Mr. Cole, I'm not here to start trouble. But protocol's clear. Any unregistered canines found near protected zones are subject to verification. There have been reports of hybrids in this area, people breeding wolves with shepherds and selling them. It's illegal." Ethan clenched his jaw. "You think I'm running some kind of operation out here?" Daniels met his stare evenly. "I think you're a man with 3 untagged animals on state land. I need to see proof they're domestic, or they'll have to be taken in for evaluation." Mara let out a low growl, her body stiffening. The officer took a cautious step back. Ethan knelt beside her, resting a calming hand on her neck. "It's all right, girl," he murmured. "He's not here to hurt you." But Mara didn't relax. She pressed closer to her pups, tail low, ears pinned. Something in her recognized authority, not as protection, but as threat. Her amber eyes flicked between the officer and the open door behind him, calculating escape. Ethan stood, his voice measured. "They've been with me for months. I trained them, fed them. They're not wild." "I don't doubt you care about them," Daniels replied. "But caring and compliance are 2 different things. These aren't yours to keep unless you can prove ownership." The words landed like a physical blow. "Not yours to keep." Ethan's throat tightened. For a moment, he saw the desert again. the day his squad was ordered to leave behind a wounded K-9 unit after an ambush. He had argued with command, begged to go back. The last thing he'd seen through the dust storm was the dog's silhouette fading into the smoke, still trying to crawl toward him. The guilt had followed him home like a shadow that never let go. He took a breath. "Give me a week. I'll get you the papers, whatever it takes." Daniels scribbled something in his notebook. "You've got 72 hours. After that, if they're still unregistered, I'll have to call in animal control." "I'm sorry, Mr. Cole." Ethan nodded stiffly. "Yeah, I bet you are." The officer hesitated at the threshold, glancing once more at the dogs. "You seem like a good man. Don't make me come back with a cage." He stepped outside, closing the door behind him. Silence filled the cabin, thick and uneasy. Mara whimpered softly, pacing near the door. Ethan crouched to comfort her, but she recoiled, tail tucked, eyes wild. Then in one quick motion, she turned, nudging Scout and Ember toward the back door. Before Ethan could react, she pushed the latch open with her nose and bounded into the snow. "Mara!" Ethan shouted, lunging after her, but she was fast, her body disappearing into the white with the two pups at her side. Only the faint trail of paw prints remained, leading toward the forest. He stood in the doorway, breath ragged, watching the family vanish beneath the trees. For the first time since Anna's death, he felt that same hollow implosion inside him. The silence after loss, louder than any explosion. By nightfall, Helen arrived, lantern in hand. Her expression turned grave when she saw Ethan sitting by the extinguished fire, the empty collars on the table. "I heard the truck from town," she said softly. "Who was it?" "State officer. Said they weren't mine to keep." His voice was low, hoarse. "They're gone, Helen. I tried to stop them, but..." Helen set the lantern down, her eyes wet. "Oh, Ethan." She sat beside him, hands folded neatly in her lap. "Don't you give up now. We can fight this." He looked up, weary. "Fight the state? They'll never listen." "Maybe not to a soldier," she said, "but they might listen to a mother." She opened her worn leather satchel and began pulling out papers. Old registration forms, letters, an adoption certificate from when her son had rescued a German Shepherd years ago. If we can show Mara's a domestic line, maybe even trace her to the Carter family's old records, we can prove she's no wild hybrid. She could have been abandoned. You found her. That makes you her rescuer, not her captor. Ethan stared at her, the faintest spark returning to his eyes. "You'd do that for me?" Helen smiled gently. "No, Ethan. I'm doing it for her, and for you. You're not losing another family. Not if I can help it." Outside, the forest was a dark sea of snow and shadows. Ethan stood, grabbed his coat, his flashlight, and the small leather collar he'd made weeks ago for Mara. Etched into its brass tag were 5 words: "Never leave your pack behind." He turned to Helen, voice quiet but certain. "If there's even a chance she's out there, I'm going." Helen nodded. "Then go. But don't go alone in your heart this time." He stepped into the cold, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the night. Snowflakes swirled like ghosts around him as he followed the fading tracks into the forest, whispering the same words that had once guided him through war zones and loss alike. "Hold on, girl. I'm coming." Night had swallowed Silver Creek whole. The forest reduced to a blur of white shadows and breathless cold. Ethan's flashlight cut through the darkness in trembling arcs, its beam slicing across tree trunks glazed in frost. The wind howled low through the valley, carrying the smell of snow and pine sap. Each step he took sank deep into the drifts, boots crunching through ice and silence. The footprints he followed, 3 sets, one larger and 2 small, were fading fast under the fresh snowfall. He kept his eyes on them, his breath coming out in ragged bursts of steam. "Hold on, girl," he whispered into the night. "Just hold on." The forest stretched endlessly, the kind of silence that made the mind conjure ghosts. The beam of his light flickered over claw marks on the bark of a pine, fresh. Mara had passed through here recently, probably scared, disoriented. Her instincts would have driven her uphill, away from roads, toward the old ravine that sliced through the forest like a scar. Ethan's gut clenched. He knew that place well. Steep, unstable, and half frozen. Exactly the kind of terrain that could swallow something alive and never give it back. He pressed forward, his Navy SEAL training kicking in instinctively. Controlled breathing, short bursts of energy, conserve heat, maintain awareness. But beneath the discipline pulsed something raw and human. A panic he hadn't felt since the battlefield. Back then, it was for men under his command. Now, it was for a dog and 2 fragile lives that had somehow become his second family. The snow deepened as he reached the edge of the ravine. He stopped, scanning the slope with his light. Nothing. Just the jagged gash of earth and ice stretching into blackness. Then he heard it. A faint, broken whimper carried up by the wind. His chest tightened. "Mara!" he shouted, voice echoing down the canyon walls. Another sound answered, a soft bark, desperate but alive. He dropped to his knees, angling the flashlight down. There, half buried in the snow 20 feet below, he saw them. Mara was lying against the wall of the ravine, one leg twisted awkwardly, shielding Scout and Ember beneath her body. The pups moved weakly, their fur clumped with frost. The fall had likely happened hours ago. The snow had collapsed beneath their weight. Ethan's heart pounded. They wouldn't last much longer. He scanned for a safe descent. None existed. The slope was nearly vertical, the walls slick with ice. He unstrapped the coil of rope from his backpack, standard climbing line he'd kept from his military days. His shoulder ached from an old injury, but there was no choice. He tied one end to a pine trunk and looped the other around his waist, testing the tension. "You've done this 1,000 times, he muttered, trying to ignore the shaking in his hands. The first few feet were easy, boots digging into the frozen dirt. Then the snow gave way. He slipped, the rope jerking hard against his harness. Pain shot through his left shoulder, a deep tearing sensation. He gritted his teeth, breathing through it. Below him, Mara barked once, weak but urgent, as if urging him not to stop. He pushed downward, muscles burning, until his boots finally touched the floor of the ravine. Mara lifted her head slightly, eyes wide and glassy. When she saw him, her body relaxed just enough for the pups to stir. "Good girl," he said softly, kneeling beside her. Her paw was bleeding from a deep gash. "You're okay now. I've got you." He pulled the small emergency blanket from his pack and wrapped it around the puppies first, tucking them against his chest inside his coat. They trembled violently, but still breathed. Then came Mara. She tried to stand, but her leg collapsed. Ethan slid one arm beneath her chest, the other gripping the rope. "You're coming home," he whispered. The climb back up was agony. The cold bit into his exposed skin, the rope digging deep into his palms. His shoulder screamed with every pull. Twice, his boot slipped, sending a shower of snow down the ravine. But he didn't stop. He could feel Mara's breath warm against his arm, could hear Scout's faint whimper through his jacket. Every sound kept him moving. Halfway up, a light appeared above. Another flashlight, brighter than his. A voice shouted over the wind, deep and steady. "Cole, hold tight." Ethan squinted upward. Officer Daniels stood at the edge of the ravine, rope in hand, his breath clouding the air. The beam from his light caught Ethan's face. "You're insane," the officer called, "but I'm not letting you do it alone." Daniels anchored his rope and began lowering another line. Together, they worked wordlessly, Ethan pushing upward while Daniels pulled from above. When Ethan reached the top, both men collapsed onto the snow, panting. Mara lay beside them, her head resting on Ethan's chest. The puppies stirred faintly, their small paws twitching. Daniels looked at the scene for a long moment, his expression softening. "You risked your life for them," he said quietly. Ethan wiped the frost from his beard. "They're my family." The officer nodded slowly, the sternness in his face melting into something human. "Yeah," he murmured. "I can see that." He took off his jacket and laid it over Mara. "Let's get them home." By the time they reached the cabin, the sky had begun to pale with dawn. Helen was waiting on the porch, her lantern burning low, her hands clasped in silent prayer. When she saw Ethan emerging from the forest, coat torn, face bloodied, carrying Mara in his arms, she gasped. The two pups peeked weakly from inside his jacket. Helen pressed a hand to her heart. "Oh, thank the Lord," she whispered, tears shining in her eyes. As Daniels carried the supplies inside, she reached out and touched Ethan's arm. "You did it." He smiled faintly, exhaustion pulling at his face. Couldn't let her go. Helen helped him settle Mara near the fire, wrapping her leg with clean bandages. The puppies huddled beside her, already warming up. Daniel stood in the corner, watching quietly. "You know," he said, "I'll have to file a report, but it's going to say you rescued a domestic dog and her litter from a ravine. Nothing about hybrids, nothing about the state." He paused, then added, "Sometimes the rules forget what they're for. Maybe they need reminding." Helen looked at him with quiet gratitude. "You're a good man, Officer Daniels." He smiled tiredly. "I've just seen too many creatures punished for trying to survive." When he left, dawn had fully broken over the valley, painting the snow gold. Helen poured Ethan a cup of tea and sat beside him. "You see," she said softly, "God doesn't take without giving something back." That night, after Helen had gone home and the fire burned low, Ethan sat on the floor beside Mara. She rested her head on his knee, her breath deep and steady. Scout and Ember were curled against her belly. Outside, the snow fell softly, no longer a threat, but a benediction. Flakes drifting through the starlight like small white promises. Ethan looked down at the family sleeping beside him and whispered, "Never leave your pack behind." For the first time, he believed the words. Spring came to Silver Creek like a quiet apology after months of ice. The mountains, once buried in snow, now shimmered under sunlight that melted the white into streams. Pine needles gleamed with dew, and the air smelled of thawing earth. The forest that had nearly claimed their lives was alive again, full of birdsong and color. Ethan Cole stood on the porch of his cabin, sleeves rolled up, hammer in hand. The sharp, rhythmic sound of nails striking wood echoed across the clearing. But this time, He wasn't fixing a leak or patching damage from storms. He was building something new, something meant to last. Across the clearing, Helen Carter watched from a folding chair, her gray hair tied back with a patterned scarf, a clipboard resting on her lap. She wore a pale blue cardigan despite the warmth, her posture straight and proud. "You've done all this in 3 weeks," she said, admiration lacing her voice. Ethan wiped sweat from his brow. 3 weeks, 5 bruises, and 7 broken nails. He smiled faintly. "But it's coming together." Helen looked up at the wooden sign he'd just nailed above the doorway. The letters, carved by hand, read, "Silver Creek Haven, for those who served and stayed." Below the words, a small bronze plaque gleamed, a Navy insignia beside a paw print. "You sure about the name?" Helen asked. Ethan nodded. "This place saved me. Maybe it can do the same for others, the kind of soldiers who came home but didn't know what to do with the silence." Helen's eyes softened. "And the dogs? They fought the same battles," he said quietly. "They deserve peace too." The idea had taken root during the long winter nights, when he sat by the fire with Mara's head on his lap and the 2 pups curled at his feet. He'd realized then that what had healed him wasn't just survival. It was connection. The way Mara had trusted him despite her fear. The way Scout and Ember had grown from trembling shadows into spirited young dogs. They had rebuilt something inside him that war had taken away. Now, with the help of Officer Daniels and Helen, Ethan was turning that healing into a mission. The cabin and surrounding land had become Silver Creek Haven, a small sanctuary for retired and injured service dogs, the forgotten veterans of other people's wars. Officer Daniels drove up that afternoon in his dusty green state truck, parking near the edge of the field. He stepped out carrying a box of supplies, leashes, harnesses, and freshly printed permits. His uniform jacket was off, sleeves rolled to the elbow, revealing strong arms marked by old scars. "You weren't kidding," he said, glancing around at the new kennels and fenced training yard. "You've built yourself a base camp." Ethan grinned. "Guess I never learned how to sit still." Daniels walked over, handing him a stack of papers. "Everything's cleared. Silver Creek Haven's officially recognized as a rescue and rehabilitation site. You'll get some funding through the state's Veteran Outreach Program. And," he hesitated, then smiled, "the department wants me to oversee your first intake." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "You volunteering?" Daniel shrugged. "Let's say I've been doing this job a long time. Feels good to be on the side of something that saves instead of confiscates." Helen chuckled from her chair. "I knew you had a soft heart under that badge." "Don't tell anyone," Daniel said, smiling wryly. By early May, the first rescues arrived. 3 German Shepherds, a Belgian Malinois, and an aging Labrador with cloudy eyes. All had served in the military or law enforcement. All carried invisible wounds. Ethan greeted each of them by kneeling, letting them approach first. He spoke softly, with the kind of patience that only someone who understood trauma could muster. Mara watched from the porch, her tail wagging slowly. Scout and Ember bounded nearby, full of curiosity. The new dogs followed her lead, drawn by her calm authority. She became the matriarch of the haven, a silent teacher. When one of the newcomers, a scarred Malinois named Rex, refused food for 2 days, Mara approached him gently, lying beside him until he ate. Ethan watched the moment unfold from afar, the corners of his mouth lifting. Guess she's got the better instincts, he said. Helen documented everything. Her writing hand, though a bit shaky with age, was steady enough to capture the heart of it all. She began composing an article for the local magazine, the Colorado Homestead Chronicle. Her piece wasn't about a hero soldier or a miraculous rescue. It was about a man and his dogs, and how love could rebuild what loss had shattered. The article ran in June, under the title, "The Haven at Silver Creek, where healing has 4 legs." Within days, letters began arriving, handwritten envelopes with Montana, Colorado, and Wyoming postmarks. Some came from veterans who had lost their canine partners in service. Others from widows who said the story made them cry. One letter, written in elegant cursive from Denver, simply said, "You've reminded me that kindness still wins." Helen read each one aloud to Ethan in the evenings. Sometimes she laughed. Sometimes she wiped her eyes. Ethan listened quietly, one hand resting on Mara's head. The flood of gratitude from strangers didn't make him proud. It made him humble. "They think I taught them something," he said one night. "But truth is, these dogs taught me how to live again." By summer, Silver Creek Haven had become a small miracle in the mountains. The wooden fences gleamed with new paint, the fields alive with barking and play. Helen tended the flower beds by the gate. Lavender and sunflowers, her favorites. Daniels dropped by weekly, half for inspections, half for coffee and conversation. Sometimes he'd stay late, telling stories from patrol days while Scout dozed at his feet. Ethan began training sessions for volunteers, teaching them to handle the dogs with respect, not dominance. "They've already done their fighting," he would say. "Now they need gentleness." The volunteers, mostly locals, and a few veterans from nearby towns, followed his lead. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped behind the pines, Ethan stood near the pasture watching Mara chase Scout and Ember through the tall grass. Their fur caught the light like gold. Helen approached quietly, a warm breeze tugging at the edge of her shawl. She stopped beside him, looking out at the scene. "They're free because you let them be," she said softly. Ethan didn't respond right away. He watched as Mara paused, turning back toward him, her tongue lolling in a happy pant. Scout tackled his sister playfully, and the 3 of them tumbled together in the grass. The sight filled Ethan's chest with something too big for words. He exhaled slowly, the weight of years lifting. "Maybe freedom isn't about leaving," he said at last. "Maybe it's about finding somewhere worth staying." Helen smiled, eyes glistening. "Then I'd say you found it." As twilight spread across the valley, the laughter of dogs and the rustle of wind through pine trees merged into a single song, one of peace, purpose, and belonging. And for the first time, Ethan truly believed that Silver Creek Haven wasn't just a refuge for broken creatures. It was proof that broken things could still build beautiful worlds. By the time another summer reached Silver Creek, the air no longer carried the bite of the old winters that once haunted Ethan's dreams. The valley had turned gold under the long daylight, the river clear and slow as glass, and the pine trees shimmered like emerald towers. The rescue center, once a cluster of wood and hope, now stood solid and alive. Kennels freshly painted, fences lined with climbing flowers, and laughter echoing from volunteers who had come to help. Yet even in the peace of that season, there was a quiet shift, a soft awareness that time, like the river, never stopped moving forward. Mara had begun to slow down. Her once powerful stride had softened into a deliberate, careful walk. The fur around her muzzle was now flecked with gray, and her breath came a little heavier after every chase. But her eyes, the same deep amber that had met Ethan's hand in that first blizzard, still burned with gentle intelligence and calm. When the younger dogs played rough near the fence, she would watch, tail wagging lightly, as though teaching them with her patience rather than her bark. Ethan had noticed the change months earlier, though he said nothing. He just started rising earlier, taking her for shorter walks, brushing her coat longer at dusk, speaking to her softly about things only the heart understands. His own hair had grown a little grayer too, but his eyes were clearer, steadier. The heaviness that once defined him had been replaced by something quieter, a peace born not of forgetting pain, but of living with it. That morning, the sun climbed lazily above the hills, spilling gold across the grass. Mara lay near the porch, Scout and Ember pressed close against her sides. Ethan sat nearby, sipping coffee from a metal cup. Officer Daniels was visiting again, dressed in plain clothes now, his badge replaced by sunburn and a carpenter's tan. He had taken early retirement and moved closer to Silver Creek to help full-time. He leaned against the porch railing, arms folded, watching the dogs. "She's still the queen of this place," Daniel said, voice low but affectionate. Ethan smiled faintly. "She always will be." Helen joined them a few minutes later, carrying a tray of lemonade. At 70, her steps had slowed, but not her spirit. She wore a wide straw hat and a floral dress, her skin soft and weathered from years under mountain light. "You boys planning to work or just philosophize?" she teased. Daniels chuckled. "Depends who's asking. If it's you, I'll grab a hammer. If it's him, we're having a meeting." Ethan grinned, but his gaze stayed on Mara. "She's been quieter lately," he murmured. Helen set the tray down and followed his eyes. "She's telling you it's almost time," she said gently. That evening, the valley glowed under the orange haze of sunset. Ethan opened the wooden gate of the rescue field and whistled softly. Scout and Ember bounded forward, tails high. Mara hesitated for a heartbeat, then stood, her legs steady but deliberate. She looked back at Ethan, waiting. He walked beside her, through the tall grass, the sound of cicadas humming all around them. They reached the edge of the open valley, the same place where, a year ago, he had found them buried in snow. The same land that had witnessed both death and rebirth. The hills shimmered under the fading sun, wildflowers painting streaks of purple and gold. Ethan knelt, resting a hand on Mara's back. "This is where I found you," he whispered. "Guess it's where I'm supposed to let you go." She turned her head toward him, eyes calm, almost knowing. Scout and Ember barked and sprinted ahead, chasing each other in the grass. Mara took one step, then another, her pace slow but certain. Ethan watched, his throat tightening as she paused midway across the field and looked back one last time. For a heartbeat, time held its breath. The light caught her fur, turning it silver and gold. "Go on," he said, voice cracking. "You're free." She turned, lifted her head toward the breeze, and ran. Her gait uneven at first, then strong again, like the echo of her younger self. The two pups followed close behind, their shapes growing smaller until they were just moving shadows in the golden distance. Ethan stood there, tears slipping unnoticed down his face, until the sound of their barks faded into the rustle of the wind. He smiled through the ache. It wasn't loss this time. It was release. Later that night, the cabin was quiet. Only the steady ticking of the wall clock and the murmur of crickets filled the air. Ethan sat at his desk, pen in hand, writing by lamplight. His handwriting was firm but unhurried, the letter addressed simply, to Helen. Dear Helen, I used to think a soldier's duty was to fight, to hold the line, to never let go. But now I know. Sometimes the bravest thing a man can do is help another soul live, then learn how to say goodbye. Mara taught me that. She didn't just survive, she showed me how to. Thank you for believing a broken man could build something good. Ethan. He sealed the letter, placed it beside Helen's basket of herbs she'd left on the table, and stepped outside. The night was warm, the moon pale and kind above the pines. Somewhere far off, a faint bark echoed, low, steady, and familiar. Ethan looked toward the valley and smiled. The next afternoon, Helen found the letter in her mailbox. She sat on her porch to read it, the sunlight soft against her hands. When she finished, she folded the paper carefully, pressed it to her chest, and closed her eyes. A single tear rolled down her cheek, not of sadness, but gratitude. As dusk settled, she sat watching the horizon, the sky brushed with pink and gold. In the distance, from beyond the trees, came a faint chorus of barks carried on the wind. She smiled through trembling lips and whispered to no one in particular. They found their way home, and so did he. The sound faded into the rustle of summer leaves, leaving only peace behind. Sometimes, miracles don't come as thunder or light. They come quietly, through a pair of gentle eyes, a hand extended in mercy, or the simple act of letting go. Ethan's story reminds us that God's grace often moves through ordinary people and wounded hearts, turning pain into purpose, loneliness into compassion, and endings into beginnings. If you've ever felt lost, remember, the same God who guided a soldier and a dog through the storm is watching over you too. Share this story with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment about where you're watching from, and subscribe if you believe that every soul, human or animal, deserves a second chance. May God bless you and keep you warm wherever you are.